I would say very clearly, I'm not a Gandhian. I'm overdressed. I enjoy an occasional glass of gin or wine. So I'm not a Gandhian, but I'm fascinated by him as a historical figure. I think I was prepared to write on Gandhi directly because indirectly he had shaped my professional work. I had about 15, 20 years of experience of getting my hands dirty in research.
But let's also go back to the origin of Satyagraha. Both the word and the idea, how did it develop? I'm guessing it's not something for the first time in the world, but probably he was the first one to effectively harness and kind of brand it.
The greatest failure of Gandhi's life in these years is the breakdown of his relationship with his eldest son, Harila.
So eventually they became estranged.
Totally estranged. So that is much later. The second son was also slightly problematic. He had a better relationship with third and fourth son. He was a master of Gujarati prose and English prose. He was a wonderful writer in both these languages. He is regarded as almost as much of a pioneer in Gujarati literature as Tagore is in Bengali literature, as a communicator.
Ram, welcome to SparX.
Thank you, Mukesh.
Yeah, really looking forward to this conversation. So in preparation for this, I started rereading the biographies you have written of Gandhi. And I first read, I think, both books in 2017 or 18, I think. And I remember enjoying it a lot, but I forgot how detailed the books are. Just recently finished reading this one, Gandhi Before India. And I think what's fascinating about this entire book basically covers his years growing up in India, time in England, and time in South Africa. Like even before he came to India to really start participating in the freedom struggle. And it's, first of all, it's so fascinating to learn how much he did in South Africa and how he refined all his tools and ideologies. But I was also wondering, Ram, on your part, I mean, this comprehensive research on Gandhi must have required some kind of, I don't know what to call it, obsession, commitment, deep, genuine interest in who Gandhi was. But must have been quite a inspiration and a process to get to this level of detail.
Yes, so let me tell you a little background of how I got to Gandhi. So I did a PhD in Calcutta in the early 1980s. And my PhD was a history of forests and peasants in the Himalaya, ending with the Chipko movement. And the leaders of the Chipko movement were Gandhians. And my teachers in Calcutta were Marxists. Now, this is a long time ago. The Berlin Wall was still standing. Calcutta had a communist government. Many of your viewers won't know, can't imagine such a time. And my teachers were good. They were conscientious. They were fine scholars. They were well-read. But they had their ideological blinkers. So one of the blinkers was that non-violence was some, feminine thing that emasculated India, and you had to have a revolution on the lines of Lenin. And another blinker was that environmentalism was regarded then as what they called a bourgeois deviation from the class struggle. You have to organize workers to bring about the revolution. And what is this protecting trees and cleaning water sources and so on? And then when I worked on the Chipko movement and I met these Gandhians, I was profoundly struck by their integrity, their simplicity, their commitment, and also their vision, because, they were talking about sustainability and wise and prudent use of natural resources long before climate change. In fact, now all their ideas are coming back. So that brought me to Gandhi.
And they were Gandhian because, that's your interpretation, or they were very professed Gandhian? That
they were. So there were two leaders of the Chipko movement, Chandi Prasad Bhatt and Sundarlal Bhagana. One had learnt his apprenticeship with Jayaprakash Narayan, and the other with Vinoba Bhave. So with direct followers of Gandhi, people, they themselves had never seen Gandhi. But they work hardy, they lived simply, they spun, they were deeply committed to rural renewal and so on. So that was my first book. Then I moved from there to a biography of a maverick, eccentric British anthropologist called Verrier Elwin, who came to India. He was actually a Christian missionary. He left the church, got inspired by Gandhi, and then spent many decades working with Adivasi people. Then I used to play cricket in college, so I wanted to do some research on cricket. And my third serious book was a biography of a Dalit cricketer called Palwankar Balu. It was called A Corner of a Foreign Field. And his whole struggle had been inspired by Gandhi. So I said, Gandhi is talking me everywhere. There's environment, there's anthropology, there's cricket. So let me settle my accounts with him.
We don't recognize that Gandhi is also stopping us from the currency notes.
That's a single currency. That's it. So that's how, so what this did, Mukesh, was, of course, it brought me to Gandhi. But by the time I came to writing on Gandhi, I had about 15, 20 years of experience of getting my hands dirty in research.
Yeah.
Knowing what the archives were like, where you would find old documents, where you find microfilms of newspapers, what role oral interviews could play, what are the limitations of interviews as juxtaposed to written primary sources, where would the letters be. So I had that experience, but I think I was prepared to write on Gandhi directly because indirectly he had shaped my professional work. I would say very clearly, I'm not a Gandhian. I'm overdressed for a show on Gandhi. I enjoy a occasional glass of gin or wine. I try and tell the truth, but maybe sometimes I don't. I like traveling by air. So I'm not a Gandhian, but I'm fascinated by him as a historical figure of profound interest, influence, and a kind of enduring relevance. So, but had I not met in Garhwal, these remarkably committed, self-effacing Gandhian environmentalists, I don't think I would have written these books.
And at what point you got, say, this 2 decades of commitment, and I think you were sharing earlier, you were thinking of doing something else as well. It's a very long-term commitment. At what point you got kind of fully sucked into this, that this is almost like a calling for you? When did that happen?
So as I said, it's a slow burning process. And a biography takes a long time to mature. It takes, ideally, you would need 6-7 years to do it justice because you don't know where the sources are. You write a draft and you find gaps that between the ages of 15 and 20, you have nothing. Or between 35 and 40, you have nothing. So then you start looking. So you have to have that, to write a serious biography, you have to have that kind of vision, And of course, I would think other things alongside. So I was writing columns. I was, occasionally teaching in universities abroad. So the rosy roti problem was being solved that way, and and I had no deadline per se. And I was very lucky in that my publishers, my main publisher for this book was Sunny Mehta, who's an Indian origin publisher in New York with Knopf. And he said, take your time. And when I said, I want to do 2 volumes instead of 1, he said, fine. So he also understood that, this is not something, it's not like a book timed for an anniversary or for an election or for a budget. Those are different kinds of books. And I have written some short books of that kind myself. But this required that expansive time horizon because I also had to plan trips. Now, one of the things, Mukesh, is that I make a living as a writer. But I have no institutional support. So I have no grants. I mean, if I was a professor in an American university, I would have access to all kinds of grants. So how do I do my research? If somebody invites me to give a talk in Barcelona, I route my ticket via London. I spend a week doing research there. I had to make 5 trips to South Africa. 2 for conferences, 3 on my own accord, right? So all this would take time, So, I mean, I'm now too old to envisage embarking on such a project. But then I was in my 40s. So I could think, like that. So I would say, again, one last point I'd make, especially for, scholars or writers who might be listening, is that I could not have written these books if I was in my 20s or 30s. I would have been inexperienced, callow, impatient, judgmental. And I could not write them now when I'm in my 60s, but I'm too old. I'm too tired. I don't have the energy. I have the energy to talk about them, but not to do all the research. So I think it came at the right time. In my 40s and 50s, when I was mature, experienced, I was confident of what I wanted to do, and I had the energy to travel all around and gather this stuff.
In some many ways, that applies to pretty much all walks of life, because at some stage of your life, you are impatient and you think you know everything, but you really don't. And it's very, you scratch the surface, you find a lot of gaps. At some point, you run out of energy. So that, those
Correct.
2 or 3 decades in between, which is pretty much where you can produce your life's work.
Correct. I mean, the exceptions, they say the best work in mathematics is done before you're 25. So maybe they're the odd exception. But you're right. Broadly, in most professions, it's,
Right.
in your 30s and 40s, possibly 50s, that you wise enough to, do your profession or your vocation proper justice or something like this.
And I think the quality shows through. If you look at this second book, right, the Years That Changed the World, is nearly 1,000 pages. and just the second part of the biography. First part is also about 600 pages.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of material about all facets of not only Gandhi's life, but through these books, you also learn about so many different characters, even history of the region. Like, for example, as I started reading this, the Gandhi before India, I actually, for some reason, never registered to me that Gandhi, his father and grandfather, both were ministers with this local, I don't know, you call king or chieftain, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
which is, I'm guessing, a fairly privileged position to be in, right?
Middle class.
And today we have Gandhi's image of at some point in his life, he renounced pretty much everything. He lived
Yeah.
very simply. But so let's go back to that. I think I noticed that a lot of things happen in the early life, as you described in the book, which are all very accidental. At some point, you mentioned that if his father did not die, he probably wouldn't have gone to England,
Yeah.
and he might have gone to the basically family profession, become minister again for the, for that princely state. So just, he did not stand out for anything in first 20 years. There's, in fact, some point, I think you dug up his marks from 5th, 6th, 7th grades,
Yeah.
and barely,
High school.
barely passing grades, right? So there's absolutely nothing standing out. And as you're going through, like, what are your thoughts? Were you looking for a spark that what this guy had in this growing?
I mean, those mark sheets, it's interesting. I found there was a small book called Mahatma Gandhi as a student, which I found in the pavement in Daryaganj. In Daryaganj, there used to be a second-hand book bazaar, published by some small publisher.
Yeah.
And that man, J.M. Upadhyay, I should mention his name, he had been headmaster of Gandhi School in Rajkot and found all this in the cupboards. And in his, in 6th, 7th, 8th standard, 9th standard, he was not doing very well. He was missing class. And I recall, the exact figures are in my book. But he, in the metric examination, he came 404th out of 800 in Bombay. So exactly in the middle. Right. Now, and though in later life we know him as a great writer in Gujarati and in English, in both those subjects he got 45 or 43. Right. And J.M. Upadhyay's, the last, after documenting all this, he doesn't comment. He just gives you all these details and these numbers. But the last sentence of his book is memorable. It is something like this. Gandhiji was known for making, heroes out of men of clay. And then he says, his first and undoubtedly his most successful experiment was on himself. So I thought that was lovely. So I think this is the kind of thing, you talk about the accidents in his life. If his father had not died, he would not have gone to England. If he had succeeded as a lawyer in Bombay, he would have just been, you and I would not be talking about him. It would just be one of 1,000 Gujarati lawyers in Bombay who had succeeded.
He tried to establish himself as a lawyer multiple times in Kathiawar and Mumbai.
Yes.
And just couldn't make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there was one incident which I was alerted to, a stray remark by a American scholar, which I then followed up in the archives in London, which is fundamental, where when he failed as a lawyer, so he goes to London, comes back, tries in Bombay, can't make it, tries in Rajkot, can't make it. Then somebody tells him, why don't you go to Porbandar where your father and grandfather worked? You'll get a job in the administration. And it so happens his elder brother was intriguing with the heir to the throne of Porbandar, who was fighting with his father. And the elder brother was involved in a robbery of the crown jewels. Which made the family name disgrace. So going to South Africa was the only kind of alternative, was escape.
That's incredible. So that if that incident were not to happen, he might have gotten a decent job.
Because he'd come back from London. You need someone, if you are in a princely state, you need someone who knows Gujarati and you can negotiate the British legal system. So very likely he would have got a job had his brother not committed this unforgivable crime, which he was innocent, but because his brother had done this, it cast a shadow on his reputation and he had to go somewhere else. So all these accidents,
And eventually I think he became at least estranged or distanced from the brother, but in some ways indirectly the brother did him a great favor. Not really, I think he also supported him, his education in England.
That's right. And of course, looking after the children later, because his kids were, two of his wife and kids were in Rajkot for 4 years while he was in South Africa and so on. Yeah.
I was also quite, when I was reading about, we have this impression of, some of these men from India will go to England, get this, barrister degree and come back. And it seems like, something which requires, very prestigious, But when you look at the details of how it is done, he has to attend this 90 dinners and study on his own and give some exam and get the certificate, right? Can you talk about that?
Rather dhila.
Exactly. I mean, it seems like,
Yes.
but you have to just show up there, basically buy a ticket and pretty much, just hang out there for a few years. And he was then, he was part of vegetarian society there. He got involved. He was also starting to experiment with, who he was and what his interest.
Because I think going out, like, you will recall, I mean, you and I grew up not far from each other. You grew up in Dehradun. I grew up in Dehradun. You grew up in Haridwar.
That's right.
And then going to college is a liberation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you can make your own friends, you can do your own things. Yeah. Now, it's similar to Gandhi. When he goes to London, he's far away from his family, from the kind of stifling and atmosphere of his caste, his community. And he makes English friends. I mean, he shares a home with a fellow vegetarian called Oldfield, who becomes a lifelong friend in 1890-91. Can you imagine? 140 years ago, a brown man and a white man. Even now, it would not be common, right?
Yeah.
Unless, of course, in America, in some college, you're in the same dorm. So I think this allowed him, London and then South Africa really expanded his mental, moral, philosophical, religious outlook.
Yeah.
And I think really made him.
Yeah, and that also has a lot of pictures, from in your book from that time. See, we have this, very caricature impression of British rule in India, where it's a very heavy-handed rule. I'm sure that obviously there are a lot of atrocities and brutality and so on. But everyday life wasn't that. There are a lot of communication, friendship, people intermingling with each other. And at least,
I'd say this, I'll just correct you slightly on this.
Okay.
So friendship between a white man and an Indian man would have been impossible in India.
I see.
But it was possible in London. In India, the British had to show they were the ruling race.
Got it.
They had to, socially and psychologically and culturally be above the brown man, But in London and in South Africa, it was possible. So in that sense, these friendships, particularly with people of different religions and different racial backgrounds, may not have been possible had he lived in India. Because in India, the boundaries were quite rigid. And as there's a wonderful book on the British civil service in India by David Gilmour called The Ruling Caste. So they set themselves up even above the Brahmins, so they looked down. But once you're in London, you can just mingle. And it's like, in a sense, it's similar to, like when Indians, that's what happened in South Africa in a different way. That in South Africa, he was not a Gujarati, he was an Indian. Yeah. So he could befriend Tamils, Bengalis, Hindustanis, Parsis, so at home, the society was segregated and confined. At work, you might meet someone of other caste, but not in the home. But in the diaspora, there was that freedom to experiment. And I think, again, he was fortunate.
As you were going through early years of Gandhi's teenage year, early 20s, this whole, time spent in England studying, did you see any sign of ambition, big ideas during those years at all?
No, not at all. Not till he goes to South Africa, where two things happened to him.
Maybe let's also explain how did he end up in South Africa, because you were not, so we wanted to talk a bit about.
Yeah. So he ends up in South Africa because the doors are closed he's a professional failure as a lawyer in Bombay and in Rajkot. And the doors are closed in princely states for a job because of the mischief that his brother has done.
He's about 25-year-old.
He is less than 24, 23 and a half. And then fortuitously, this opening comes in South Africa, where there are two merchants who are quarreling, two Gujarati merchants who are relatives and are quarreling. Very common, very, things that happen still. Yeah. You don't have to be Gujarati. You just have to be fighting with your brother or your cousin and, over business.
They say you're in business with family, you will end up fighting.
End up fighting, right. And Gandhi, again, because he knew the correspondence was in Gujarati, but the case was being fought in a colonial court following British jurisprudence. So he was then asked to settle it. And then he goes there to settle one case and stays 2 decades. And two things happened to him in South Africa. One, I think, is, again, must be counted a stroke of luck. He is in a monopoly position. He's the only Indian lawyer in South Africa. So he's not competing with people who are more articulate, more eloquent, more cunning, more strategic. Any Indian has a case, they come to him. Whether you're a poor indentured laborer or a prosperous merchant, you come to this one lawyer. The other thing that happens to him is that he finds a calling. He sees that the Indians are suffering racial discrimination. And as a lawyer and as a writer, he is in a position to help and aid and advise them. So he finds a calling only accidentally, a purpose.
Yeah.
I mean, I have problems with the word ambition, but a purpose, a calling, that his life has a purpose beyond just making enough to survive. I think that happens to him because he can see that the Indians in South Africa need him to articulate their grievances, to take forward their struggle and so on.
And this calling, do you think, happens in early years? So again, it takes some time to develop, because he came, I think he tried to come back to India a couple of times. Again, those attempts were also not very successful.
He tries to come back once. So he's there 1894, 1893, then to 1896. Then he comes back to bring his wife and children, and then they stay till 1901. And his first spell is in Durban, which is on the east coast of South Africa in the province of Natal. And then he comes back for a year and a half, and then he goes back to Johannesburg, which is in the interior, in the province of Transvaal. So I think quite early, he goes in 1893. By 1894, he is writing petitions for Indian rights. And he feels wanted, he feels cherished. And he also thinks he has a social and moral obligation to help his fellow Indians.
And somewhere his public speaking also, I guess, takes time to improve, because I think you talk about the incidents where he was so nervous early on that someone else had to
read his speech. That's right.
So was it like consciously putting an effort to get better, or just kind of...
No, I think he was never great. So he was first too nervous this is in Bombay, but even the records of his court appearances talk about his stumble and his stutter. So I'm not sure he would have been a great success in the Supreme Court today, where you have to really be commanding in your presentation. And even if you look much later, Mukesh, at the few visual recordings of his speaking, he's an indifferent speaker, but his sincerity is what shone through. And he was in many ways a much better writer than speaker. And of course, the petitions he had to all write, and I think those still stand the test of time. They're very carefully worded, argued, structured.
Yeah. And Ram, I'm dwelling on this earlier part of his journey, because for most of us, the larger narrative is, he basically appears out of nowhere from South Africa, a hero, and then his, efforts in India starts. But as you were researching, I know you read a lot of letters, archives. I think you went through a lot of newspaper of the time, including very first mention of him in American newspaper and British newspaper and so on. What are some of those, things that, that you were not expected to find, which you found either very interesting or maybe even moving?
So there were many such revelations, but let me mention one or two. One, I think, is particularly important in my telling of the story. Now, if you look at Gandhi's autobiography, Mukesh, there's the story of his being thrown out of the train. And that becomes the kind of fulcrum of how the lawyer became an activist and an anti-racist campaigner. And Attenborough's film is structured around that as the kind of defining moment, as the kind of eureka moment of where he really wakes up. I found that more important is an incident that occurs 3 years later when he's returning with Kasturba and the children, and there's a racist mob at the Durban port, which, from the newspapers you can recount, the intense hatred that thousands of white people feel for him. So the train incident is one ticket collector. It could be an aberration. But here I found evidence of a collective mob mentality. Because of his activism, his petitions, the whites of Durban and working class whites. So there's, my account, which is drawn on the newspaper of the time, has the butchers, the masons, the carpenters, all saying Indians are taking away our jobs. I mean, it's like,
it's happening all over again in US now.
US now, right? We are being Bangalored, we are being Gujaratified, back in 1897. And, he was almost lynched. And I think that's something, and then he was saved by a white policeman's wife. And that kind of made a profound impression on him, because all through his life, Gandhi never demonized white people. He said imperialism is bad, but ordinary Englishmen can be nice, good, noble, kind, just like all of us. So I think that is, one part of my book which I was very pleased with documenting this collective racial opposition to him, not just one ticket collector.
In this particular incident, he was basically quarantined C for almost 3 weeks.
Yeah, that's right.
And then, I think got beaten up also.
Yeah, it's right, because they weren't too scared to allow him to come, and then he took a boat, and then they found him, and then they beat him up. Yeah. So I think that was something. And of course, the friendships. I think the other thing about this first volume, as you say, there are many characters in it. And many of these characters are not known or hardly known. In fact, in some cases, totally invisible. So if you look at the second book, and you look at the Gandhi's time in India, even if the details in the second book are new, and that's why I required 1,000 pages, the characters are known. So you know that Gandhi's great, most, how would I put it, remarkable associates were Patel, Nehru, Sarojini Naidu, Maulana Azad. You know that his most intense political disagreements were with Jinnah and with Ambedkar. You know that Bose occupies a position which is both as a disciple and as a disputant. So you know the names. You may not know the nuances, the details. But when it comes to his South African period, you know, the people who helped him, who worked with him, you know, some of them were white, like Polak and Kannenbach and his female secretary, Sonia Schlesien. Some of them were Muslims, like Kachalia and Dada Abdullah. Some were Tamils, like Thambi Naidu and his family, who played such important roles in Satyagraha. And who were really like Nehru and Patel and, you know, all of them. And I think those characters, writing about them, finding out more about them, and, you know, narrating their relationship with Gandhi, which was so important to him. Because, you know, after all, they made him. I mean, it was his interactions with them, his collaborations with them, that shaped him as a thinker and practitioner of Satyagraha and interfaith harmony and all the other things of a simple life and all the other things that he's known for. So I also, when I started this, I was much more familiar with the cast of characters in his later life. Some of them I hardly knew about. I kind of knew about Kannenbach. I knew about Doak because Doak had written the first biography of Gandhi. But Sonia Schlesien, I don't think I knew about her. You know, and she was a quite extraordinary woman, because here is a young Jewish girl who joins Gandhi, becomes his secretary, talks back to him, you know, talks to him about women's rights. When the Indians go to jail, she goes on a cycle taking food from one jail to another. She wants to become the first, just as Gandhi is the first Indian lawyer in South Africa, she wants to become the first female lawyer and fails because of the, you know, because of the gender barrier. But she was really very important to Gandhi. Again, you know about Mahadev Desai, who was his remarkable secretary in India, and who was at his side from 1917 till 1942. But the person who played that role in South Africa was not just a secretary taking down notes, was actually an interlocutor, an advisor, a sounding board, a companion. You know, so I think that was it. To learn about these people and to be able to flesh them out in some detail and to show that they had as central a role in Gandhi's life as Nehru, Patel, Bose, Azad, etc. I think that gave me a lot of pleasure.
Right. And who were the people, you know, who Gandhi was listening to in those years, listening to or reading about or taking inspiration from? Because he was trying to develop his ideology and what he believes. And like, I think that what comes across this book slowly, that some of his core ideas and philosophy started to take shape during those years. But what was his source for inspiration?
The way I answer it in this book, there are many people who influenced him. You know, many people whose writings, conversations with whom shaped him. But there were three people who played a critical influence. And I'll say a little bit about each of them. The first was a Gujarati philosopher, Jain philosopher called Ramachandra Bhai, who was a friend of Gandhi's. And Gandhi comes back to from London, and his mother has died, and he doesn't know that. So he comes off the ship and he's told about that, and then he meets Ramachandra Bhai at a friend's house. And Ramachandra Bhai then consoles him and becomes a mentor and a preceptor, both on questions of non-violence and also religious pluralism. You know, how you can be a good Hindu, but not yet have empathy and understanding for people of other faiths, whether they're Muslims or Christians or Parsis. So first there's Ramachandra Bhai. Then there is Gokhale, who's a kind of a political mentor, who introduces him to politics, who talks about the importance of women's emancipation, or the caste issue, social work. And then finally there's Tolstoy, the Russian thinker, you know. And I argue in my book that it's interesting to see the sequence. First there's a Gujarati, Ramachandra Bhai. Then there's an Indian who's not a Gujarati, who's Gokhale. And then there's a Russian figure. So even through the choice of his mentors, he is expanding his moral horizon. He's becoming more capacious in his understanding of what's going on. So I think these three people were really very, very significant to him. And of course, Ramachandra Guha was a friend of the family. Gokhale, he meets in the course of his work. But Tolstoy is quite remarkable because Tolstoy is the greatest writer of his time.
Yeah.
And here is an unknown Indian just writing to him, just saying, this is what I'm doing. I need your blessings. I've been inspired by you. And Tolstoy is so pleased that he writes back. I mean, it's like, just think of it. I mean, again, you have to transport yourself back to a time when there is no smartphone, no internet. And from Johannesburg or the Phoenix Farm in Natal, here's an Indian reading Tolstoy, being inspired by him, and then writing him a letter. And this is the last years of Tolstoy's life. In fact, Tolstoy dies in 1910, and then Gandhi writes a very moving obituary of him in his journal, Indian Opinion. So I think these are the three kind of mentors.
I mean, Ramachandra Guha and Gokhale, I think he has a lot of, he spent time with them and in-person interaction. But Tolstoy was mostly correspondence.
Just a few letters here and there. And of course, he read his books. Now, we don't know what books of his he read. Now, he read his philosophical works. So there's a book of Tolstoy called The Kingdom of God is Within You. So the kingdom of God is within you. And from that, Gandhi took two lessons. That is, you find your own path to God. Of course, there's some similarities to our bhakti poets and so on. You don't, as I said, demonize people of other faith. And you don't need a temple or a mosque or a church or an imam or a pujari or a bishop to guide you. You can find your own path to God. Now, he reads that. He also reads Tolstoy's writings on a simple life. And he's very influenced by the fact that Tolstoy was a hugely successful novelist who then said, I'm never going to write a novel. It's anymore. It's an indulgence. It's a waste of time. I'm going to devote myself to understanding what life is all about and to simplify my life. And of course, then he embraces brahmacharya, which is what Gandhi also does. Gandhi similarly is a successful lawyer who then becomes a full-time activist. But there is no evidence, clear evidence, that Gandhi read Tolstoy's novels. So during the pandemic, when all of us had more time, I set myself a challenge. I said, I'm going to read War and Peace and Anna Karenina. I'm going to go better than Gandhi. And I'm grateful because they're two of the greatest novels ever written. And they just opened so many worlds to me. But he read Tolstoy, who by then was well enough, so well known that he was coming out in English translation, and then wrote to him. One last thing I'd say about Tolstoy, which is a kind of a factoid, a kind of quizzing factoid. If someone was to think of the two greatest people of the 20th century who did not get a Nobel Prize, it would be Tolstoy in literature and Gandhi in peace. And both are absolutely scandalous, that Tolstoy not to get the literature prize. So maybe that's something else he shared with Tolstoy.
No, fair enough. Maybe they were cribbing to each other about that. Or maybe. Initially Gandhi establishing himself as a lawyer in South Africa and basically helping settle disputes among people, representing Indians, and a lot of just cases involving permits and licenses and approvals, and he knew how to work the system, speak the right language, and so on. I think that when the transition happened, when he started in some ways to take on the local colonial government in a very confrontational manner, which I think leads to his, first imprisonment there at some point.
Yeah. So the thing about Gandhi was there were these racial laws. So first, Indians were not allowed to trade. And there were several of them. I just mentioned them briefly. One was that Indians were not allowed to trade in white localities. They were not allowed to live in white localities. They were not allowed to go from one province to another. They had to have a permit all the time. So Gandhi's different struggles. And then at one stage, even Indian marriages were declared illegal. Unless you had a Christian priest to Hindu and Muslim marriages were declared as illegal.
And these discriminatory laws were particular to South Africa, or they were kind of colonial feature everywhere?
They were particular to South Africa. So you didn't have, in say in Bombay, so say in Colaba, which is the most, even then the rich people's part of Bombay, if a Parsi merchant wanted to open a store, he could open a store. The Englishman may still patronize the store run by an Englishman, but there were no barriers of this kind. And Gandhi's method always was not outright militancy. First, write a letter, then have a conversation, then have another conversation, then write to the British authorities that I want to launch a Satyagraha. Then give them another chance. So he goes to London in 1906 and 1909 because the South African government reported to the imperial government, control from there. So and then finally launched Satyagraha. And so in a sense, his method is incremental, which is very interesting because it appeals to me because I believe that laid the basis of Indian democracy. That dialogue, debate, not blasting your head off because I disagree with you. You know. But young people today are disenchanted, think that, revolutionary violence would have played a better role. But his method was always that, that give people a chance to change their mind, and call them to their better senses, tell them that this is an injustice they're committing. And if they don't, then maybe start a movement. And I think that method, which he also applied in India much later, every one of his satyagrahas in India starts with a letter to the viceroy saying the salt law is wrong, please repeal it.
Yeah.
If you don't repeal it, we'll start a satyagraha, but I think that's very, as I said, that display of patience, of tolerance, of understanding your opponent, and only finally confronting him with satyagraha if everything else fails. So that is developed in South Africa.
Let's double click on a couple of those points. One is, I think, again, comes across in book, as you go through slowly, that his way of arguing for things is, in some way, very incremental. He's basically looking for what is the minimum I can get away with now. And if the other side pushes back, he keeps looking for that angle. And the whole, it seems like a zoom out that you can still make progress or long term, just small wins will add up as opposed to all or none, go home, go bust kind of thought process, right? That's
and also in South Africa, so there are two things. In South Africa, that incremental approach was... there was no other alternative because there were just 150,000 Indians.
Alternative was do nothing, which
do nothing. In India, that incremental approach that we can talk about later was because Gandhi worried that if you start violence against the British, ultimately you turn on each other, But in South Africa, the Indians were a small community. The whites were more numerous than them. They had political and economic power. And of course, you have the Africans with whom Gandhi had no connections at all. In fact, this... I say right at the end of my book that he had not a single African friend. I mean, he had, Parsi friends, Muslim friends, Buddhist friends, Hindu, Jewish friends, Chinese friends. But somehow he was, it's only much later after he comes back to India that he gets to understand the sufferings of black people, both in South Africa and in America. That's another story, But I think the Indians were very vulnerable because they were caught betwixt and between. And I think small diasporic minorities are always so I think he had no other option. He couldn't really launch an armed struggle. In India, it became a moral issue. There, it was a pragmatic issue.
Understood. And that because he exercised that pragmatic, issue for a while, it became part of it. He could see it's effective. It's also really not creating deep enemies or definitely not provoking strong, violent reaction.
That's it.
So he harnessed into, for much greater effects later. But let's also go back to the origin of Satyagraha. Like, both the word and the idea, how did it develop? I'm guessing it's not something for the first time in the world, but probably he was the first one to effectively harness and kind of brand it. And at some point, I think he runs a contest, also paid contest to find the right name for it.
So, Mukesh, I briefly talk about it in the book, and I've been thinking a lot about this. There are precedents in Indian tradition. For example, especially in princely states. So the Raja, supposing, and Gandhi would have known of these, and he refers to them also in one or two of his writings, that, for example, if the crop fails, the peasants write to the king, saying, this year the crops have failed, so we won't pay the annual tax. The king says no. So they peacefully march to the palace and sit down in a dharna. I mean, dharna, hartal. These are Indian words that long predate Gandhi. Dharna and hartal, for example.
What's your idea? Dharnas have been going for hundreds of years?
Yes, at least, 16th, 17th century, dharna and hartal. So, some other words come later. Satyagraha comes later. Then Rasta Roko comes later. Jail Baro Andolan comes later. Bhook Hartal comes later. Now, these are all Hindi words that are expansions of non-violent protest.
Yes.
But Hartal and Dharna are before Gandhi. So Dharna particularly, if you, as I said, the peasants say कि राजा से कहते हैं कि माफ कर दो, वो tax माफ कर दो, and he doesn't agree. They go and sit in front of the palace peacefully, and after 2-3 days, they say, okay, he says okay. Now, so Gandhi knew these. So at that, so when in 1906 he in 11th September 1906, which is 9/11, 95 years before the other 9/11, the first meeting is held in Johannesburg, where Gandhi says that, we will not pay the taxes, we will go to jail, we will not obey these racist laws. And then a few days later, he leaves for London to negotiate with the British. And in London, he sees the suffragettes, women who want the vote, protesting non-violently. And that's a kind of validation of what he wanted to do, even though he has the Indian president of Dharna and Hartal also in mind. And so he's building on something that's there, and then he's adapting, innovating, perfecting. And then he looks for a name. First he thinks of Satyagraha, then his nephew says Satyagraha, and he likes that very much. And then, of course, that enters the lexicon.
I mean, and he started using this word in South Africa itself.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Got it. And during this time, was he thinking actively about at some point coming back to India, or it was not top of mind?
So, that is one, by about 1910-11, he wanted to come back to India. We don't have it in his words. So Gandhi never ever says, this is why I returned to India, left South Africa in 1914, and of course returned only in 1915. But I found these remarkable letters written by his friend Pranjivan Mehta, who says, your calling is here, you can do so much more here, and you are a Mahatma, and you have to go and mobilize the Indians, who are 300 million, not just 200 million, not just 150,000. So I think eventually he comes. There could be other reasons. He may have wanted his children to have a better education in India, and so on. But he never actually tells you why he came back.
Not even his autobiography.
No
explanation of that.
I think that's where the ambition comes. Where there, in that particular case, I'd be willing to use the word ambition. He says that's a much larger universe, a much larger theater for me. Let me try it myself there. And of course, he's done these 20 years of apprenticeship, and then he comes back and does that.
Yeah, and one of the unique things about his way of writing and protest was he was also borrowing from pretty much many different religious traditions. He read Gita again many times. He was pretty well versed with Bible eventually, and he would use arguments from Bible against the British, which will always give you a pause.
Yes,
that is very provocative. That there is this Indian guy teaching me about the lesson of Bible, etc. Is that was like? Did you come across? Is that a deliberate part of his strategy? I was just genuinely curious about it.
He's always curious. I mean, he's curious about every religion, and that comes from early on. I'd put it like this: he has a real serious interest in Christian thought, and the figure of Jesus appeals to him. A simple man, ascetic man, seeking peace and justice. Though in everyday life, the Christians violate every one of his precepts, which is what he's telling them. You're carrying a Bible and look at how you're behaving, right? With Islam, it's not so much that he's attached to the theology, but he sees it again as vital for national unity that Hindus and Muslims have to work together. He has Jewish friends. His version of Hinduism is very interesting and eccentric. So again, it's the kingdom of God within you. So when he was a young boy growing up in Gujarat, his mother may have taken him to a temple. But after that, he never visited temples. Well, there were 1 or 2 exceptions. Once in Madurai, when he went to the Meenakshi temple because they admitted Dalits for the first time. So he wanted to show his approval of that. It's kind of very, there's a very nice book. Again, one of the best books written on Gandhi. Scholarly books, not a biography. It's by a Belgian scholar who moved to Australia called J.T.F. Jordan. And it's called Gandhi's Religion, a homespun shawl. So how he, knitted these different elements, not from, great learning or deep study, but he just made up this kind of syncretic religion of his own.
Got it.
It's a very good book. Gandhi's Religion of Homespun Shawl.
Religion of Homespun. Okay, all right. Other thing that, pretty much every other chapter we are in the book, basically we are reading except from things you are writing to friends, to British authorities, to other freedom fighters in India to Tolstoy and so on. He was like writing relentlessly,
Yeah.
right? He must have written, I don't know, millions of words or.
And so his collected works are 97 volumes. And they don't contain everything he wrote because I found in the archive some interesting letters that are not in the collected work.
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons. You couldn't get access to the South African archives and so on. Yeah, and he was, he was in this period of his life, it is English and Gujarati. Now again, one interesting, very interesting aspect of his South African journey. You talked about religion and his religious pluralism and his encounters with Christians and Muslims and Jews and Parsis.
Yeah.
But one other another way in which South Africa had a formative influence on him, that it exposed him to the fact that India was a land of many religions and many languages. Yeah. So linguistic pluralism, I mean, it is unique to India that we have so many languages and we don't say one language is superior to the others, comes from Gandhi and his experience in South Africa. So when he starts his magazine, Indian Opinion in 1903, it's a weekly, is printed in 4 languages, 4 scripts, English, Hindi, Gujarati and Tamil. Now, so I think that is, so he is fluent in 3 of them, English, Gujarati and Hindi, fluent as a writer and speaker, not just as a, I write my books in English, I can have a conversation in Hindi, but I can't, write a document in Hindi. I don't know about you, but,
I struggle with 2 languages. Yeah. I struggle with Hindi and English, doing all 3 properly.
Yeah. So that was, and in Gujarat, he was a master of Gujarati prose and English prose. He was a wonderful writer in both these languages.
Correct.
Simply, clearly, effectively, directly. And of course, I don't read Gujarati. Most of his stuff is in translation. But he is regarded as almost as much of a pioneer in Gujarati literature as Tagore is in Bengali literature. As a communicator, not as a poet or anything, but as someone who made the language simple, accessible for everyday use.
Yeah. Hey, Ram, you are, been writer all your life. I think writing also in some ways, plays a role in just shaping your own thought process. I mean, to a limited extent, I use writing in my work also. Even the work I do at office, whenever I sit down and write something, it just becomes that much clearer to me. Yeah. I don't practice it that often, but I think it's an incredibly powerful tool. And I was feeling like, if anyone can write, guessing he was writing probably 4 or 5 hours every day for most of his life. And that can also really shape your thought process, because you are rehearsing arguments, rewriting, rephrasing, and playing a lot of things in your head, right? So it's an extremely powerful tool.
So. It clarifies your thought. And in India, of course, Mahadev Desai was able to, take dictation in Gujarati. There he didn't have that. So he had to actually write like Hind Swaraj. Yeah. He wrote in 9 days. It's a book he wrote in 9 days. And he says that turned from right hand to left hand, because he was just full of ideas on that ship coming back from London, and particularly on nonviolence and Hindu-Muslim harmony, and he just wrote it. Now, so it's, he was so many things, and also a very accomplished writer.
Just going back a little earlier, which caught my attention, was when he first decided to go to England, he was actually ostracized from his society and, very publicly and so on. And he had to, at some point, he has to go through whole purification ritual, etc. But contrast that to the fact that, as you mentioned, that, in UK, he was living with a British gentleman. In South Africa, he was living pretty much everyone, a lot of Muslims, he was very comfortable living in their house, and, which is significant change, from where he was coming from to where he ends up within 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe that's a sign of, that broad-mindedness and the ability to accept
all of that, but it's also partly circumstance that he doesn't succeed in Bombay. So if he succeeds in Bombay, I would suspect, had he succeeded as a lawyer in Bombay, 90% of his clients would have been Gujaratis. A majority Banyas like himself. And even if some of the clients were, Maharashtrians or Hindi speakers, at home, he would have lived in a Gujarati neighborhood, talking Gujarati with fellow Gujaratis. So certainly in some ways, because it was liberating. This going to South Africa is liberating.
Yeah, it's reminding me of you have read this guy, The Hero's Journey. The part of basically Hero's Journey, this forgetting the author's name now, but that is like 14 stages of most hero's journey, and the one critical one is exile. And a lot of great things happen. If you look at and think of Ramayana, Mahabharata, every big story has an exile period. In some way, South Africa ends up being that for him.
It's not, that's true. That's true.
Right. I mean, he has varied exposure, different characters, different experience, a lot of introspection, right, and so on. I was just wondering also, as his activist career was, evolving South Africa, at some point did he start to become a well-known figure in India as well? Like, how did that start to happen?
So it happened only in late in his career, late in his South African career, that particularly the last Satyagraha of 19 is becoming known and people are writing about him. But in 1913-14, when he has this long march, which is a kind of an anticipation of the Salt March, with thousands of Indians, including many working class Indians from the coal mines and the sugar plantations, march from Natal to Transvaal, defying the law which says Indians can't cross the border. And many people are arrested, including his wife and other women. That makes him a great hero, that he's leading this struggle. And I found in the course of my research poems written about him, a Telugu play composed about Gandhi in 1913-14. I mean, this is just a revelation for me. And I say one other thing. One of the minor heroes in this book is Ratan Tata. Not the Ratan Tata after whom today's Ratan Tata is named, who was the son of Jamshedji Tata, who funds Gandhi. And whose letter to Gandhi, which I quote, is to Gokhale is saying that I'm funding Gandhi because he's fighting for rights of Indians everywhere, So I think Ratan Tata recognizes this quite early. But after this 1913 Satyagraha, he becomes a household name, even in places like, because many of the Satyagrahis are from South India. They're from Tamil Nadu and Andhra. But that happens quite late. And it could also be, now that you say this, it could also be that this is the time he realizes I can go back because people know me and maybe I can build on that.
Fair.
Yeah.
Other thing I learned from the book, Ram, is there were a lot of Indians doing reasonably well in England, even towards the end of previous century, I guess 19th century, including two member of parliament, which was Dadabhai Naoroji and one more person. Bhavnagri, right?
Yeah.
That was quite incredible. It's very hard to believe.
No, see, I think England is changing. And parts of England are becoming more liberal. So there's the Liberal Party, and I think they're becoming slightly more open. Of course, both are Parsis, so they are very fluent in English, they're westernized. But it is true. And there's also later on a black MP and then another Parsi MP and so on. Yeah.
Majority of the whites must have voted for them, otherwise you can't elect it.
Yes.
Right? And Gandhi, at some point, he was very in active collaboration
because he wanted their advice on his movement in South Africa. Right. And Naoroji was kind of a mentor for him.
And were British in England noticing Gandhi as a major nuisance by this time? No?
Only South Africa and a little bit in India. No, the British were not. It's such a large empire and he was a small activist. I mean, he comes to the attention of the British only in 1920, really, after he's back.
There were some very interesting anecdotes, I think, in the first decade of last century of at least brief interaction with Churchill when he was also very young and upcoming person, right?
1906.
They had obviously eventually very long.
That's the only meeting.
Yeah.
That's the only time they actually met.
Oh, they never met after that.
I mean, Churchill said the most vicious and abusing things about Gandhi later. Yeah. And Gandhi wrote him a couple of letters, but they only met in 1906. When Churchill was Under Secretary of State for the colonies and Gandhi goes to South Africa and briefly meets him. They have one meeting for about half an hour, 40 minutes. That's the only time they were in the same room together.
I see. Got it. And I think Jinnah also wrote him some letters, which I think we don't know the contents of.
And I speculate that maybe they were starting a legal collaboration. That Gandhi wanted a Muslim lawyer to join him. I mean, it's very interesting, very intriguing. You just have in the logbook, you say letters to Jinnah, letter received from Jinnah.
Yeah.
And this is the time Gandhi is looking for a partner in South Africa. So I just wonder, what if they had started legal partnership in South Africa?
Yeah, they were incredible. I think you mentioned 1907, 1908. Both were fairly young and unknown people at that time. It would have been interesting to know exactly what that was about. Just zooming out, Ram, so Gandhi, I mean, at some level, obviously it's one of the probably most well-known as well as most significant figures in India. But the interest around them also, I don't know how to characterize it. I'm guessing it's probably maybe peaked at some point, had waned at some point. It's not necessarily, top of mind for people. I think if I compare other historical figures from West, like, let's say Einstein. I mean, I think he's in news all the time. He never is out of news in some ways, or like whenever you discuss certain aspect, you go back to him. Or in some of the, Lincoln, for example. Gandhi is not discussed that much in, let's say, last few decades.
So I think Satyagraha is an idea that has been adopted everywhere. So even just the idea of street protest, peaceful street protest to come to challenge authority, dictatorship. But some of his, I think Gandhi is making a comeback now in the environmental sphere too, because some of his environmental ideas are, I think, quite prescient and precocious. But yes, I mean, it's ebb and flow. It's an ebb and flow. Yeah.
So Ram, while we've talked about Gandhi's evolution as a lawyer initially and then activist and a political figure, but there were a lot of parallel stories going on. One is this very complex relationship with his wife, brother, kids, I think nephews, some where to educate them, South Africa or India, and as these his kids were getting to teenage years, some tensions. How was he navigating all of it? It somewhat seems like he was also little resigned to not doing too much about this.
No, I think in some ways, if you look at this period, the greatest failure of Gandhi's life in these years is the breakdown of his relationship with his eldest son, Harilal. And there are many reasons for this. One reason is that Harilal was born just before Gandhi goes to England. Then Gandhi comes back and then goes to South Africa. So the first 5 or 6 years of his life, the boy doesn't see the father. Then he goes back, then he comes back. Harilal joins him in South Africa, but then comes back, gets married. Gandhi disapproves of his choice to have a love marriage. So it's a very anguished, complicated relationship. And Gandhi does not come off well because he's intolerant, unforgiving, judgmental. Of course, the only thing that can be said, not as a way of excusing Gandhi's behavior, but of contextualizing it, is that he had his child very early. So Gandhi was about 18 when Harilal was born. So in his mid-30s, when Gandhi is in his mid-30s, he's having what we call a midlife crisis. From law, he's moving to activism. And Harilal is having his teenage crisis, and there's a clash. I'll just bring in my personal experience. When I was in my mid-30s, I also had a midlife crisis. I had a professorship in Delhi, which I gave up and became, for the life of an uncertain freelance writer. I said, I don't want to be in Delhi, I want to go to Bangalore. But my eldest child was then, 5. So he didn't know the turmoil in his father's mind, and maybe Sujata, my wife, felt some of it, but the children were. So I think that clash between the father having his midlife crisis in his late 30s and the son having his adolescent crisis, I think, but deeply wounded Harilal. And Harilal was obviously a very remarkable man. If you read the letters that Harilal wrote as a 16, 17, 18-year-old, very, very easily as intelligent as his father. He was also a Satyagraha. He goes to jail several times in South Africa. So he also has fearlessness and courage.
First time at the age of 20 at Gandhi's behest.
But then the relationship breaks down, and then Harilal's wife also dies a little later. So it's a terrible, and of course, then much later, Harilal becomes an alcoholic and he just crumbles. And
so eventually they became estranged.
Totally estranged. So that is much later.
What about his other kids?
The second son was also slightly problematic. He had a better relationship with third and fourth son. But if you just read Harilal's, you read about him, you read what he wrote, he was clearly a quite extraordinary human being who was broken by what he saw as a unsympathetic father. And this is not to excuse Gandhi at all, but you will find it in the case of many great men. I mean, Einstein was a disastrous father. I mean, Picasso, forget it, how he treated his wives and, So, but I think that this you really feel for Harilal because he was clearly an exceptional person.
And what is Gandhi's own view about this, during his 30s, but also later years, did he write much about, first of all, how the relationship with Harilal panned out?
No, you have to reconstruct it from the letters. And again, I mentioned one good book on Gandhi by Jordan on religion. Well, the most perceptive books is a biography of Harilal by a Gujarati writer called Chandubai Dalal, translated by Tridip Surud, who's a great Gandhi scholar in Ahmedabad. And it reconstructs all the letters between them. And it's that's a very important source because Gandhi doesn't refer to it. I mean, Gandhi is in Experiments with Truth. He doesn't really talk about it. He talks a little bit about how he treated his wife with indifference, but not the children.
Yeah. At some of the letters, and some of those are, I think, in the book also, he has fairly explicit at some point in his life, saying, "My commitment to community and the cause and the dedicated purpose is more than my commitment to family."
I think that was clearly the case with Harilal and Manilal.
Yeah. And around this time, I mean, he started, I guess, this whole, we talked about the whole vegetarian society, even, in his England, but a lot of experimentation with lifestyle, diet, various therapies and so on, including being very prescriptive about it. I think you talk about his argument here, there's this, I think, this British couple who was, living with him, and he's almost enforcing that they can have milk because it's bad for them and things like that.
One of the British couple, one of them, the husband, Henry Pollack, gives him Ruskin's book to read, and then he starts his first settlement, which interestingly does not call an ashram. He calls it Phoenix Farm, and the second one is called Tolstoy Farm. And it's only when he comes back to India that he, in the Indian context, he feels farm, ashram has more meaning than farm. But he's living close to the land, working with your hands, planting crops, running a printing press and doing your work on the printing press yourself. So bringing out the sheets of your newspaper. And that is, again, very unusual because in India, as you know, there's such a divide between mental and manual labor. And the upper caste do the mental labor and the lower caste is about the manual labor. And here he is, really laying the foundations for his later critique of, untouchability and some of the things that he talks about much later in his career. He was forever experimenting. In fact, I think it's appropriate that he calls his... it's not an experiment with truth. It's his experiment with himself. His experiments with political strategy, with friendship. And the one experiment that fails is with his children.
And what is the thought process behind these farms and, later, I guess, ashrams? The first one, as you said, was called Phoenix Farms.
So the several principles. One is live simply. The second is build a community of activists who will transform society. So, the core is this 50, 100 people who are with you. You live together, you share views, you pray together. So, one of his innovations is an interfaith prayer meeting where, different scriptures from different religions are read. Then working with your hands, producing your own essentials. And these are the people who will then be the most steadfast Satyagrahis. So, for example, much later, this is something he works out in South Africa, but much later, when he, in 1940, he starts something called the individual Satyagraha movement, before Quit India. So he chooses Vinoba Bhave as the first Satyagrahi because he's the best pillar, the most selfless worker in the ashram. So I think it's also preparing a community for action. And it's very interesting because it's not, I suppose the precedent would be the Ramakrishna mission. Because previously ashrams were withdrawal. They were like monastic orders where you turned your back on society. Here you are engaging with yourself, but also taking your reflection and your spiritual growth out again to society to transform society.
And in some of these choices, at this point, do you start to see like some, emergence of long-term strategy, planning far ahead? Like no, but just instinct-driven.
Just instinct-driven. I don't think he's thinking far ahead. I don't think he knows, that all idea of this is going to happen.
So just very earnest in some level. He's exposed
someone says, this very relevant whom I mentioned before, says that this ashram is a combination of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. So Vivekananda has action. But Ramakrishna is also inward spirituality, meditation, the silence day, one day a week where you don't talk.
Yeah.
So
in most of the walk of life, and again, maybe the Harilal family might be the exception, it seems like just the courage of conviction. He has this all kind of ideas and ideas to action, probably incrementally, but there's not too much gap. It's not like he's thinking something and doing something else.
Not at all. And he has that, absolutely, he's driven by that conviction. And sometimes also, which you mentioned earlier, the certitude. So other people must also have that. If they don't have it, if Harilal is not willing to abandon his wish to be a successful lawyer, then he's not totally with the Satyagraha, right? So sometimes he imposes that on people, which is slightly problematic. But he's absolutely fearless. I mean, he's killed in 1948 by Godse. But there are at least half a dozen attempts on his life before that. I mean, he's completely fearless.
Yeah. And no mention during the South Africa years of at all giving up or considering a different life. I know at some point at least he was talking about potentially going back to England and studying medicine. I don't know how serious that was. But
he got very interested in in healing. He was always in health and healing. And at one stage, he did consider briefly, there are a couple of letters I discovered, but it was a passing fancy.
Got it. So eventually in 1914, I think he decides to move back to India. What happens to the whole Indian struggle against the Britishers? Does it continue or it dissipates after he leaves?
So what happens is he leaves South Africa and he says that his close associate, Henry Pollack, who was Jewish and who had worked with him, had learned the law with him, was his co-editor on Indian Opinion, that he would, and was respected by the Indians, that he would work with Indians. But then when Gandhi comes back to India, Pollack and his wife decide to leave for England. And then Gandhi sends his second son, Manilal, to South Africa. And Manilal stays there till the 1950s and is running Indian Opinion, organizing Indians, but also then becomes briefly part of the broader anti-apartheid struggle and even has an acquaintance with Nelson Mandela, a slight acquaintance. But and then, of course, other people in the struggle. I mean, this is something which is not well known, is that the people who are with Gandhi in the struggle in South Africa, the Indians, two people in particular, Thambi Naidu, who's a Tamil, and A.M. Kachalia, who's a Gujarati Muslim, their children and grandchildren become very active in the anti-apartheid struggle. They join the ANC, they go to jail, they are tortured. Kachalia's two sons are close friends of Nelson Mandela. Thambi Naidu's grandson is in Robben Island with Nelson Mandela. So the tradition of activism that Gandhi begins among the Indians carries on right through the 20th century. And the Kachalias and the Naidus are two examples of people of Indian descent who played fundamentally important roles in the anti-apartheid struggle. And the others too, there was someone called Ahmed Kathrada, who was with Mandela for almost 20 years in jail. There was a person called Yusuf Dadu, who's earlier on, who inspired Mandela and who knew Gandhi. So it's a very, he lived behind this legacy indirectly.
Yeah.
That then, continues right up to.
So in 1914, he's planning to move back to India, and obviously he's going to get involved in some ways, much larger struggle by this time. I think his ideology as well as tools are fairly well refined, in some ways ready for, bigger game. You love cricket, so going from league cricket to playing for the country, literally in this case situation. But looking back for and you studied very closely his 20 years, was he able to, through all his effort, move the needle significantly for Indians, at least for a time being, after he left?
To a limited extent. Yeah. Because it was a very racist society. So there was an annual tax that was removed. The barriers to moving between provinces were eased. The law banning Hindu and Muslim marriages was repealed. But they weren't equal citizens. That took a very long time. Of course, the Africans were even less equal citizens. But it was transformative in his own understanding. Had he not done what he did in South Africa, had he not had the kind of experiences and developed the kind of understandings he did, he could never have become a leader in India.
So it's probably fair to say that South Africa in many ways made who Gandhi is, right?
Absolutely. Without question.
Right.
Without question.
Yeah. And then, obviously he moves back to India, and I think that's focus of our second book and our second episode, Ram. So we'll pick up that conversation, as we do our second episode. But thanks so much for taking the time. It's so fascinating to learn from both Gandhi's, biography and what he did, but also the incredible work you have done to go back to so many of these sources and bring out the story alive. I have to say, while it's a biography, it reads like a novel. Literally, I'm finding I'm not able to put it down.
So that, I think, is partly because the excitement of discovering things that are new to me.
Yeah.
I never thought that I'd discover all this stuff. And I suppose some of that is communicated. Yeah.
No, amazing. I'm glad you did that, and look forward to second conversation soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
At SparX, we aim to bring to you stories of exponential impact. We share in-depth analysis of what goes behind success stories. If you find our conversations interesting, you can join us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to SparX on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other audio platform of your choice. If you have any suggestions on who we should invite or what topics we need to cover, just let us know in the comments. We are always listening, looking for ways to improve, and keep getting better as we go along.